Joining us now to provide an overview of the South African agriculture space are John Purchase, CEO of Agbiz, and Hans van der Merwe, Executive Director of Agri SA. And of course, we still have Drickers, our market watcher, joining us for this session. Gentlemen, very good to have you. Let's first start off with perhaps, John, you just painting the landscape of the agriculture industry for us right now. What are the big issues and what is the big picture looking like?
Yes, so we've just released the Agribusiness Confidence Index and for the second quarter, and it's still more positive than negative, although the confidence has come down slightly, but it's just marginally above what we call the 50 level. That means it's very close to negative. So it's not looking too bad, but it's also not great. Generally, if we look at conditions in agriculture, with the good rains that fell, especially in February, March, the crops are looking good in the summer rainfall area. The grazing has recovered remarkably well after the drought, a very serious drought that we had, especially in the northwestern regions. And then in the Western Cape and most other areas, it's looking pretty good from an agricultural production condition side. The biggest problem in agriculture at the moment is the uncertainty around policy and legislation. And
well, that's the thing. I mean, it sounds like you're saying farmers are happy, but farmers are never happy. It rains too much or it doesn't rain enough. But you were saying farming's looking pretty good at the moment. But Hans, there was this report over the weekend. I thought it was neglected in the English-speaking media. Rapport, the Afrikaans Sunday newspaper, had it as the full front page. 50% of all commercial land, commercial farms, to be given to the workers on those farms or bought out everywhere in South Africa. And this, not a rumour, but a government document which has already been put out for consultation. Farmers not happy about that.
For sure. But it wasn't news to us. This thing is forthcoming for quite some time, and it was only after the second workshop with government that it really entered public space. Fact of the matter is, I think government is frustrated about a couple of things. The relative slow progress, as they perceive it with land reform as such, the high cost of acquiring land, and the high rate of failure of new entrants into farming. And this is a model that tries to address it, but I think neglects a couple of fundamentals in the economy and society in the process.
Aren't you talking about a few fundamentals in the economy? Thinking about economies of scale. You know, farming is either intensive exercise or a very extensive one. We need a scale to be profitable. Splitting a farm in half, basically, is what you're going to do. You know, they're talking about 50% ownership of the land, not 50% ownership of the business per se. So that's a big difference. It's not an incentive in a running concern as such, but splitting the farm in half actually splits the economies of scale as well. What does that do to food security?
Well, it's a major problem. If you look at farming debt, what will happen with financial institutions that are funding it? I think about half the farmers, if not more, will immediately have liquidity problems and deep financial problems, and the financial sector will lose money. What you're quite rightly saying is agriculture is changing globally. And if you have low levels of support, low levels of protection, the only way that you can survive is by making use of economies of scale. And this will be detrimental to the smaller and medium-sized enterprises, especially the larger guys for sure as well. But I will see that the backbone of rural South Africa will be broken in the process. And if that happens, for sure, it's on the input side that the linkage effects will have negative leverage on the sector. The same will apply downstream. So I think it's too ghastly to contemplate.
So what you're saying, a lot of farmers, if you split their farm in half, doing what they're doing normally would actually make them unprofitable, and they will stop farming altogether.
Well, in many cases, farmers themselves and sons find it difficult to farm together. Now you must farm with a number of laborers as well, and share equity and find new management structures. That is very complicated. In the process, you lose half your equity and you lose half your income as well. So it can only be to the detriment of the sector.
John, a quick one to you. I mean, two aspects to this. The first is what recourse do farmers have if this does go into being a piece of legislation? Can it be challenged? Can you push back? But also it raises the question about other interventions such as the Agri BE fund. This was the instrument that should have led us to not being in this situation in the first place. Are we saying the fund is completely null and void? Is it just not worth having it there?
Yeah, I think we've got to look at alternatives too, and answers correctly said it's not going to work, and also from the financial side that we represent, there are huge concerns as to who stands guarantee for the debt, etc. that's going to happen in this case. But the recourse is a good question. We must also remember that there are already schemes in place, like a farm equity scheme, that's a voluntary scheme. So we say you can look at voluntary schemes, but also not on the basis that it's given to us now in this proposal, but we can look at other schemes that have already been implemented, especially in the Western Cape, some of the fruit farms there. So there are farm equity schemes that can work, but they are structured on a voluntary basis and not on the basis that this the policy document gives.
What's been the traction of the voluntary schemes? Are we finding that farmers are voluntarily going forward, contributing to those schemes, and we're seeing equity being distributed? I see Hans wants to respond to that one.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that statistics will show that 70% of farmers are really small to micro businesses actually. So for these farmers, it is a question how to survive. To share equity is virtually impossible for them.
Isn't the focus also on land perhaps misguided? And it's an emotional thing in South Africa because land was taken away from people. Land, people had no chance of owning land. So it's a very emotional issue. But actually what you're wanting perhaps is to share in the profits. So you have share option schemes perhaps. Workers with more experience in a particular field or more service could perhaps get a better share of the profits, when there are profits, because you can't share losses.
Yes, that's a point. That's a point that we would rather take up and look at other alternatives. It could be through the BE structuring, which also provides for land sharing or land ownership or an equity part in land, or in the enterprise too. So we think that if you do it on an enterprise basis, there are other alternatives that will be far more practical and provide more security. Also for where the financiers come into, because the implications on the financing sector is going to be huge in agriculture.
Just another question. You talked about certain or 70% of the farming community or farming industry being smaller or micro actually type of organizations. Where do you draw the line? If we go for the alternative, getting a type of ESOP, employee share incentive programs on the run, getting a stake in the business as such, not in the land, which you said is quite right, is misguided, that the equity should be in the land, it should be in the business, because that's where the profit is. The profit isn't necessarily in the land. Where do you draw the line? What kind of business or what size of farm or business is actually big enough for it to successfully implement employee share incentive scheme?
But I think, can I answer that?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's where the BE thing comes in, because what you have in the BE, you have the EMEs, which is exempt micro enterprises, and then you have a special. That's right. You have a special dispensation for that. Then you have the QSEs, which brings in your medium or your bigger size enterprises, and then you have your open group, which is in the new codes of good practice is about 50 million turnover. So you can structure it according to that, and we believe that is the right way to
absolutely.
go.
Hans, looking at this, the report that I read, and it was said it was based on a government document, and the graphic which showed a 50%, and then different categories of workers would be allocated different amounts of land, also based on that document. It sounds like a very blunt instrument. Is it more than coincidence that we have an election in a couple of weeks' time?
I believe it is a card that is being played in a very emotive run-up to an election. But that some people think along these lines is also reality.
Yeah.
So while I can say it is foolish in my view, we shouldn't underestimate the seriousness of it as well. But I think there are serious politicians in government that are also seriously concerned about the content of this proposal. And we have opened up, I think, a dialogue with the minister for the next couple of months, if not a year, to thrash out the details. And I think a lot will depend, the outcome will depend also on the alternatives that we pursue, the alternatives we put on the table, and also to give more publicity and content to what is actually already happening in agriculture. It isn't as if nothing has happened. We have already gained a lot of experience and successes, and we can build upon that as well.
As you go into those discussions and negotiations with the minister, what are you going to, in essence, in a summary, saying to Gugile Nkwinte? What is it that you want to get out of that conversation?
Well, first and foremost, what is important to government, not only transfer of land, we must have food security. You cannot ring fence a problem like this or a proposal like this to agriculture. It is a question, how do you treat assets in the economy through government intervention? And we have got a lot more to lose if this kind of approach is applied to the rest of the economy. So we must be sensible and realistic and make sure that we find solutions that I think comply to sound economic approaches towards growth and stability.
I think you raised a very important point, David, about land versus profits, because I think there is a debate around there. I think those who feel hard done by, they want land back so that they can generate their own profits. And I think that's the core of the debate.
But of course, but then farming the land is another matter.
And the thing is, as I understand, and you guys must help me, you're the experts, there is, as I understand, a lot of land available that farmers has put up for sale. They are willing to sell it, but the process involved, or the process is not running as it's supposed to be, and the money is not flowing to those farmers. They're not getting bought out, and somewhere the system is broken. It's not that there's not enough land available.